The Great Hall of the Concordat had no windows. That was the first thing Anna Shaw had noticed when she arrived 3 years ago, and it still bothered her. 47 species had built a chamber to govern the galaxy and not one of them had thought to let in the light. She stood at the center podium now, her hands flat on the cold stone rail, and looked up at the tiers of seats rising around her in a wide circle. Hundreds of alien faces looked back. Some had eyes she recognized. Some did not. Some had no faces at all, only sensors and breathing masks and the faint hum of translation devices clipped to their frames. Anna was 41 years old. She had grown up in a small town in the north of England where it rained 9 months of the year. She had studied law, then diplomacy, then spent 15 years learning how to speak to people who were nothing like her. She was not famous. She was not brilliant in any way that made people stop and stare. She was simply the kind of person who did not quit, and Earth had sent her here because of it. She cleared her throat and began. She told them about Harrow Station first. A farming colony, 12,000 people, grain fields that stretched to the horizon. The Vreth had hit it on a Tuesday morning, local time. By Thursday there was nothing left standing above 1 meter. She had seen the survey images. She did not describe them in detail. She did not need to. Then she told them about Port Marin. Then New Edessa. Then Callum's Rock, Felt, Outer Tyne, and 11 more after that. 17 colonies in 4 months. The Vreth moved fast and they did not take prisoners and they did not send warnings. They simply arrived and then the colony was gone. 412,000 people. That was the number. Anna said it slowly and she said it clearly and she let it sit in the air of the chamber for a moment before she moved on. She told the council that Earth was invoking the Mutual Defense Accord. The accord was 80 years old. Every member of the Concordat had signed it. It said, in plain language, that an attack on one member species was an attack on all. She was not asking for a favor. She was asking them to honor a document they had already agreed to. She finished speaking and stepped back from the podium. There was no applause. There never was, here. The council members turned to one another and began to murmur in their own languages and the translation devices around the room hummed and clicked as they worked. Then the first speaker, the senior Vayari delegate, tall, pale, with long fingers that never seemed to stop moving, raised one hand, and the room went quiet. He announced that the council would deliberate. The human delegation was asked to wait outside. Anna walked out into the corridor with George Hart beside her. George was 28, thin, and had the particular kind of calm that comes from being too tired to be nervous anymore. He had been her aide for 2 years. He carried her files, remembered her appointments, and made very bad tea on a small portable heater he kept in his bag. He offered her a cup now. She took it. They sat on a stone bench in the corridor and waited. 1 hour passed. Then 2. George read something on his data pad. Anna looked at the floor. The corridor had no windows either. By the 4th hour she had stopped expecting good news. She was not sure when exactly that had happened. Somewhere around hour 2, she thought. There was a particular kind of quiet that came before a door closed, and she had learned to recognize it. By the 6th hour she was simply tired. When the chamber doors opened and the attendant called them back in, Anna stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked back to the podium. She stood very still and looked up at the first speaker, who looked back at her with an expression she could not read and probably never would. He began to read. Resolution 7. She had not heard that name before. It had not existed 6 hours ago. They had written it while she waited in the corridor with bad tea and a stone bench and no windows. Humanity was classified, under Resolution 7, as a Tier 0 instability. That phrase meant, as far as she could understand it, that Earth and its colonies were considered too unpredictable, too young as a spacefaring species, and too potentially dangerous to be granted the full protections of Concordat membership. The request for military aid under the Mutual Defense Accord was therefore denied. Furthermore, restrictions on human fleet movements in Concordat-adjacent space would be drawn up and presented within 30 days. The first speaker finished reading and looked down at her and waited. The chamber was completely silent. Anna stood at the podium and felt something move through her that she did not have a clean word for. It was not rage, exactly. It was colder than that. It was the feeling of understanding something for the first time that she should have understood a long time ago. It settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water, and then it was simply there, and she was calm. She did not shout. She did not argue. She had spent 15 years learning that neither of those things changed anything in a room like this. She looked at the first speaker for a long moment. Then she looked slowly around the chamber, at all the faces and all the tears, and she took her time doing it, and several of them looked away before she did. Then she stepped back from the podium, turned, and walked toward the door. George fell into step beside her immediately. He had that instinct, she had always appreciated it. He did not ask what had happened. He had heard every word. He knew exactly what had happened. They were nearly at the door when she stopped. She did not turn around. "George," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Yes," he said. "Send a full transmission to Earth," she said. "Everything. Every word of that resolution. The vote count if they'll release it. The exact classification. All of it." "Understood," he said. "Don't summarize it," she said. "Don't soften it. Send it exactly as it was read." "I will," he said. She nodded once, and pushed the door open, and walked out of the chamber of the Interstellar Concordat for what she already knew, in that cold settled part of her chest, would not be the last time, but would be the last time she walked out of it as a delegate asking for help. The corridor was long and gray and still had no windows. She walked to the end of it without stopping. Behind her, George Hart pulled out his data pad and began to type. The war chamber was 40 meters underground and it smelled like cold air and old coffee. There were no decorations on the walls. No flags, no paintings, no maps behind glass in golden frames. Just gray concrete, long fluorescent lights, and a rectangular table that seated 43 people. It had been built to be used, not looked at, and everything about it showed that. Nora Cross sat at the head of the table and read the transmission from Zanera Station. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she set it down on the table in front of her, very carefully, the way a person sets something down when they want to make sure they do not throw it. She was 63 years old. She had short gray hair, reading glasses she never quite remembered to take off, and a way of speaking that made people listen without her ever raising her voice. She had run the United Terran Directorate for 9 years. Before that she had been a judge. Before that she had been a lawyer who took cases no one else wanted. She had spent her whole life in rooms where difficult things were decided, and she had never once left one of those rooms early. She looked up from the transmission. The room was full. Generals, admirals, intelligence directors, senior ministers. 42 people around the table and not one of them was speaking. They had all read the same transmission on their own screens. They all knew what it said. Nora looked down to the far end of the table at Fleet Admiral Sam Reed. Reed was 57, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been through several things it would rather not discuss. He had commanded ships for 30 years before he commanded fleets. He was not a man who said much, but when he did speak, people tended to write it down. "Admiral Reed," Nora said. "Readiness status. First Armada." That was all she asked. One question, 8 words. Reed stood up. He did not look at his notes. He did not look at the ceiling or the table or anywhere except directly at Nora Cross. "Fully operational," he said. He sat back down. Nora nodded once, slowly, like she was confirming something she had already known but needed to hear out loud. Then she looked around the table. "We will vote," she said. "All in favor of activating the first Armada and proceeding under Protocol 9. Every hand in the room went up. All 42 of them, some quickly, some after a half-second's pause, but all of them. Even Minister Hargreaves at the far left end of the table, who had spent the last 4 years arguing that humanity should be patient with the Concordat. Even he raised his hand, and he kept his eyes on the table when he did it, and no one said anything about it. Nora did not raise her own hand. She was not a voting member. She simply looked at the room, counted, and then said, "Unanimous." The word landed in the room and then the room was quiet. It was a particular kind of quiet. Not the quiet of people with nothing to say. The quiet of people who understood exactly what had just been decided and were sitting with the weight of it. 43 people in a concrete room underground, and not one of them spoke for a long moment, and the fluorescent lights hummed above them, and somewhere far down the corridor a door clicked shut. Nora broke the silence. "Admiral Reed," she said, "you have full operational authority from this moment. No further authorization required." Reed nodded. He was already reaching for his communicator. What happened next, the Concordat would never fully understand, because they had never been allowed to see it. For 30 years, quietly and carefully and without any announcement, humanity had been building. It had started after the first contact negotiations, when Earth's early diplomats came home from their first meetings with Concordat species and filed reports that all said roughly the same thing in different words. The galaxy was old and humanity was young, and the older species did not hide the fact that they considered this a problem. Some said it kindly. Some did not bother. But the message was consistent: Earth was tolerated, not trusted, and the difference between those two things was large. The Directorate had read those reports and made a decision that was never written into any public document or announced in any speech. They decided that Earth would smile, and cooperate, and attend every meeting, and sign every accord, and meanwhile, quietly, in shipyards on the dark side of Luna and in dry docks behind the asteroid belt that Concordat sensors were never quite pointed at, they would build. Not to conquer. Not to threaten. Simply to be ready, if the day ever came when being ready was the difference between surviving and not. That day had come. The first Armada had 314 capital ships. They ranged in size from fast destroyer-class vessels 200 meters long to the flagship, the UTS Iron Meridian, which was 4.8 kilometers from bow to stern and had taken 11 years to build. They had been sitting dark and cold and silent behind Luna for the better part of a decade, fully crewed, fully stocked, running on minimal power so that their energy signatures were as small as possible. When the activation order came through, they powered up together. Will Carr was a navigation officer on the Iron Meridian. He was 26 years old and had been posted to the ship for 8 months and had spent most of that time doing routine drills and eating meals in the lower deck canteen and writing long messages home to his mother in leads that he could not send because communication silence was protocol. He was at his station when the order came. He watched his console screens change from standby amber to full operational green, one after another, faster than he could follow. He heard the engine pitch change beneath his feet, felt it in his chest, a deep slow vibration that grew and grew until it was less a sound than a pressure. He looked up through the narrow viewport above his station. Outside, across the dark surface of the moon, the drives of 300 ships were coming online. The light they produced was gold and vast and steady, like a sunrise in a place where the sun had never risen before. It spread across the gray lunar rock and lit the craters and ridges and flat dead plains in warm gold light, and it grew brighter as more ships powered up, and brighter still, until Will had to look away. He looked back at his console instead. On Zanera Station, somewhere on the far side of the solar system, a Concordat analyst stared at a sensor reading that had just appeared on her screen and did not move for a long time. Then she sent an emergency signal to Earth demanding an explanation. The signal was received in the war chamber. Nora Cross was informed. She read it, folded her hands on the table, and said nothing. No one answered it. The Iron Meridian had been moving for 19 hours when the Concordat ships appeared. They came out of faster-than-light travel in a neat line directly across the Armada's path, 12 vessels spread wide, running full lights and full Concordat colors. It was a formal intercept. Every protocol followed, every signal correct. They were not attacking. They were blocking, which was a different thing, and they clearly expected it to work. The lead Concordat ship opened a channel immediately. The face that appeared on their screen was not what they had expected. They had probably expected a diplomat, or at least someone who looked like they wanted to talk. Instead they got Sam Reed, who was sitting in the command chair of the Iron Meridian drinking something from a plain metal cup, and who looked at their transmission the way a man looks at something that is mildly in his way. The Concordat captain began speaking. She was a Vayari, pale and long-fingered, and she spoke in the formal register that the Concordat used for official warnings. She cited 3 separate articles of Concordat space law. She said the Armada was in violation of restricted transit corridors. She said that under Resolution 7, human fleet movements required prior approval. She said that the Concordat demanded the Armada halt immediately and that a diplomatic team would be dispatched. She spoke for about 40 seconds. Reed waited until she was finished. Then he leaned forward slightly in his chair, looked directly at the camera, and said one word. Move. He said it quietly, the way a person says something they do not expect to have to repeat. There was a pause on the other end of the channel. The Concordat captain looked at someone off-screen. Then she looked back. She began to speak again, citing the same articles. Reed reached forward and closed the channel. He then opened the ship-wide intercom and told his navigation team to maintain course and speed. He told the weapons teams to stay at standby, not active. He was very clear about that. Standby, not active. The Iron Meridian continued forward. For 4 minutes, the 12 Concordat ships held their position. The Armada kept coming, 300 ships in formation, filling the space ahead of the intercept line like a slow wall of gray metal and gold engine light. The Concordat vessels held. Then they held a little less firmly. Then, one by one, they moved aside. They did not move quickly. They moved the way people move when they are trying to make it look like they are choosing to move, rather than being made to. But they moved. Reed watched them go and said nothing. He finished whatever was in his metal cup and handed it to someone nearby and looked at the navigation display. The Armada passed through the gap without slowing down. On Zanera Station, every sensor array they had was pointed at the approaching human fleet now, feeding data to analysts who were sending reports to council members who were sending urgent messages to each other in 14 different languages, none of which helped. The council chamber had been in continuous session for 11 hours. The first speaker had not left his seat. The debate had gone in circles so many times that several delegates had simply stopped speaking and were sitting with the expressions of people who had realized, too late, that they had made a very serious error and were now watching the consequences arrive at 300 ships wide. The Vayari faction was still pushing for a military response. Strike the Armada before it reached Zanera. Show strength. The first speaker had not agreed and had not refused. He had simply kept the session running, which was its own kind of answer. 2 junior Concordat members had already sent private messages to Earth through back channels. The messages said different things but meant the same thing: we did not vote for Resolution 7, we want to talk. Reed had been informed. He had read both messages and filed them and kept moving. It was in this moment, 19 hours into the approach and roughly 6 hours from Zanera, that the distress call came in. Will Carr heard it first because it came through the navigation band before it was routed to command, and his station picked it up half a second before anyone else's. He saw the origin point on his screen, New Carthage, out on the frontier, one of the newer colonies. And he saw the signal classification, which was the highest emergency rating in the human fleet system, and he felt his stomach go cold and quiet. He flagged it immediately to the bridge commander, who flagged it to Reed, who read the full content in about 20 seconds and then stood up from his chair. New Carthage. Population 900,000. The Vreth had arrived in force 8 hours ago, which meant the call had been traveling for 8 hours before it reached them. Full assault, ground and orbital. Colonial defense forces were gone. Civilian shelters were holding but not for long. Estimated time to total collapse of all remaining resistance, 4 hours. 4 hours. Reed stood at the central display and looked at the map. New Carthage was not on the way to Zanera. It was a significant detour. If he turned the whole Armada it would take time they might not have, and Zanera would sit and watch and draw whatever conclusions it liked. He made the decision in less than 30 seconds. He turned to his fleet coordinator and told her to split the formation. 200 ships, everything in the second wing, would break off immediately and go to New Carthage at maximum FTL. Full combat readiness. No delays. The remaining ships, the first wing, would continue to Zanera on the original course. The fleet coordinator began issuing the orders before he had finished speaking. Wilcar watched it happen from his station. He watched the second wing begin to break away from the main formation on his display, 200 green markers on the screen peeling off to the left and reshaping into a new formation with a speed and precision that came from 8 months of drills done right. He watched them align. He watched their FTL signatures begin to build on the sensors, that particular energy pattern that meant a ship was about to fold space and vanish. And then they were gone. 200 ships, one moment present and the next not, leaving a gap in the formation that felt much larger than it looked on the screen. The Iron Meridian continued forward with the first wing, and the stars ahead were still and cold and the same as they had always been. Will turned back to his navigation board and did his job. He checked their heading, confirmed the FTL approach timing for the Zanera system, logged the split in the ship's record. But for a moment, just a moment, he thought about New Carthage. He had seen the population figure. 900,000. That meant children. Schools. Playgrounds that probably looked like playgrounds everywhere, the same worn equipment, the same noise. He hoped, quietly and to himself, that whoever was down there had been smart enough to get the children underground early. Into the deep shelters, behind the thick walls, away from whatever was happening above them. He had no way of knowing. He had no way of doing anything about it from here. He looked at his screen and kept flying. The second wing came out of faster than light travel in the wrong place. That was the point. Every naval doctrine in the Concordat said you never exited FTL inside an enemy formation. The risks were catastrophic. Miscalculate by even a small margin and your ship materialized inside another ship, and then both ships were gone and the question of who won was irrelevant. It required the kind of precision that most species considered impossible at combat speeds, and so they had never tried it, and so they had never built a defense against it. Human navigators had been practicing it in simulation for 11 years. The 200 ships of the second wing dropped out of FTL simultaneously, inside the Vreth formation, at a distance of 400 meters between each human vessel and the nearest enemy ship. For approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. This was because the Vreth did not understand what they were looking at. One moment the space around them had been empty. The next moment it was full of human warships, close enough to see hull markings, close enough that the engine wash from the nearest ships lit up the Vreth bridge windows like floodlights. Their targeting systems, which had been pointed at the colony below, had to swing a full 180 degrees. Their crews, who had been fighting a ground battle and an orbital bombardment and not a fleet engagement, had to find new stations, new targets, new responses. 2 seconds was not enough time to do any of that. The second wing opened fire at the end of those 2 seconds and did not stop. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 11 minutes. The Vreth fleet had 180 vessels. They were not small ships and they were not poorly armed, and under any normal circumstances they would have been a serious problem. But normal circumstances required space and time and warning, and they had none of those things. The human ships were already inside their formation. Every shot the Vreth fired at a human vessel risked hitting another Vreth vessel on the other side of it. Their formation, which had been a strength, became a trap. 11 minutes. When it was over, there were no Vreth ships left in the new Carthage system. There were pieces of ships, spread across a wide area of orbital space, cooling in the dark. There was debris. There was a great deal of electromagnetic interference from destroyed reactors. There were no survivors from the Vreth fleet. The colony below had taken damage. Some of the outer settlements were gone. But the shelters had held, most of them, and the population center was intact, and when the all-clear signal went down to the surface, the response that came back up was a single word repeated in about 40 different ways by 40 different people all transmitting at once, which the communications officer on the Second Wing flagship translated simply as, relief. The Concordat observers who had been monitoring the new Carthage situation from a safe distance had watched the entire engagement on long-range sensors. Their reports back to Zanera station used words like unprecedented and total and 11 minutes. The analyst who filed the primary report added one personal note at the bottom that was not standard procedure. She wrote, "I do not think we understood what they were." She was not wrong. At Zanera station, Reed had been informed of the outcome at New Carthage before his shuttle even docked. He read the report standing up, in the small cabin of the shuttle, while his pilot ran the approach sequence. He read it once, folded the report, and put it in his jacket pocket. He did not say anything. He looked out of the shuttle window at the slow-turning bulk of Zanera station getting larger as they came in, and his face showed nothing in particular. He went in alone. This had been decided before they left Earth. No escort, no guards, no weapons. Not because it was safe, but because of what it said. Walking on to Zanera station with 100 armed soldiers said one thing. Walking on alone said something else entirely, and what it said was that Reed considered the situation so thoroughly in hand that he did not feel the need to bring anyone with him, and that was a more powerful statement than soldiers. The docking corridor was lined with Concordat security. They watched him walk past and did not move. He was one man in a dark blue dress uniform with a single row of service pins, walking at a pace that was neither fast nor slow, and he looked at the corridor ahead of him and not at them, and they let him through because no one had told them not to and because there was something about the way he walked that made the idea of stopping him feel complicated. The council chamber doors were open. He walked in. The chamber was full. Every delegate still on the station was in their seat, which was most of them, because no one had wanted to be somewhere else when this happened. The first speaker stood at the front. The room was completely silent when Reed entered, and it stayed that way. Reed walked to the council table. He reached into his jacket and took out a small data chip, the kind used for formal transmissions, and he placed it on the table in front of the first speaker. He set it down flat, without any particular force, the way you set down something you have carried a long way and are glad to put down. He stepped back and waited. The first speaker looked at the chip. Then he looked at Reed. "What is this?" he said. "Humanity's withdrawal from the Concordat," Reed said. "Formal and permanent. Our terms for the transition. And a full record of every vote cast on Resolution 7, which we will be keeping." The first speaker was quiet for a moment. "And if we do not accept these terms," he said. "They are not a request," Reed said. The room was very still. Someone near the back made a sound that the translation devices rendered as something between protest and alarm. The first speaker raised one long hand and the sound stopped. He looked at Reed steadily for a long moment. "Is this a declaration of war?" he said. Reed picked his cap up from where he had set it on the table edge. He turned it once in his hands. Then he looked up at the first speaker, and at the chamber full of alien faces in their tears, and he said, very quietly and very clearly. "No. That was yours. The day you let our people die." He put his cap on. He turned and walked back toward the door. No one spoke. No one moved to stop him. He walked the full length of the chamber in silence and pushed the door open and came out into the corridor. Anna Shaw was standing there. She had come on the second shuttle, as planned, and she had waited in the corridor, as planned, and when Reed came through the door she looked at his face and read it the way she had learned to read rooms, and she knew it was done. She fell into step beside him without a word. George Hart, standing 2 paces behind, folded his data pad under his arm and followed. The 3 of them walked down the long corridor of Zanera Station and did not look back, and their footsteps were the only sound, steady and even, all the way to the dock. The Concordat did not fall like a building falls. It did not collapse all at once with a loud noise and a cloud of dust that everyone could point to and say, "There, that was the moment." It fell the way old things fall when the thing holding them together finally gives out. Slowly. Quietly. In pieces, over days and weeks, while everyone who had built it looked at each other and could not quite agree on whose fault it was, which was itself part of the problem. The first signal came 4 days after Reed walked out of the chamber. It was from the Solari, a small species from the outer edge of Concordat space, 8 counselors and a population of about 40 million spread across 3 worlds. They had voted against Resolution 7. They had said so at the time and been ignored. Now they sent a private transmission to the Terran Directorate, careful and formal and very polite, expressing their deep regret at recent events and their sincere interest in establishing a direct relationship with Earth outside of Concordat structures. Nora Cross read it at her desk in Geneva and made a note and moved on. By the end of the second week there were 6 more signals. Then 4 in a single day. Then a trickle that became a steady stream. 11 species in the first month, each one reaching out privately, each one using careful language that meant the same thing underneath: "We are looking for a new arrangement and we would like it to involve you." The Concordat held emergency sessions. The first speaker issued statements. There were votes on reform proposals, on new accords, on revised versions of Resolution 7 that tried to undo the damage by changing the wording. None of it worked, because the problem was not the wording. The problem was that every species in the Concordat had now seen the sensor footage from New Carthage, and they had done their own quiet calculations, and the calculations all came out the same way. Humanity had been sitting at their table for 30 years, patient and polite and apparently harmless, and the whole time, behind the asteroid belt and on the dark side of their moon, they had been building something that destroyed 180 warships in 11 minutes. That changed how people thought. Not just about Earth. About everything. About what else they might have been wrong about. About what other things sat quietly at tables and smiled and waited. The 800-year-old alliance did not end with a vote or a declaration. It ended with absences. Empty seats at sessions. Bilateral deals made outside the chamber. Species that used to speak through Concordat channels calling each other directly instead. It ended the way marriages sometimes end, not with a fight but with 2 people who have stopped pretending, and the Concordat had nothing left to pretend with. On the 42nd day, the Vreth surrendered. Their fleet commander came alone on a single ship with no weapons active and requested permission to dock with the Iron Meridian. Permission was granted. Will Carr was the officer on duty at the receiving dock when the ship came in, which was not planned but also not changed, because Reed saw no reason to make it a bigger occasion than it needed to be. The Vreth commander was smaller than Will had expected. He had seen their ships, which were large and built with sharp angles, all aggression in their design, and he had expected the same from the people inside them. The commander was compact, dark-skinned by Vreth standards, and walked with a slight stiffness that suggested he had been injured recently and not fully treated. He stopped in front of Will and waited. Will was 26 years old and had not been trained for this particular moment. He did the thing that felt most natural, which was to nod, and gesture toward the corridor, and say, "This way." He took the commander to a plain meeting room and offered him a seat and asked, through the translation device, if he wanted anything. The commander looked at the table for a moment and then asked what options there were. Will said there was water, and there was tea, and he was not sure what else was available at this hour. The commander asked what tea was. Will explained, briefly, that it was a hot drink made from dried leaves that humans had been consuming for several thousand years and that it tasted better than it sounded. The commander considered this and said he would try it. Will made 2 cups on the small heater in the corner of the room, the same kind George Hart carried in his bag, and set one in front of the commander and one in front of himself, and they sat in the plain room on the Iron Meridian while the formal surrender documents were being prepared down the corridor, and drank tea, and did not say much, and it was not comfortable exactly but it was not hostile either, and Will thought that was probably the best you could hope for, in the circumstances. The formal documents were signed an hour later. Reed witnessed them. He did not make a speech. On New Carthage, the rebuilding had started within 72 hours of the battle. Earth had sent construction crews on fast transports before the debris had even finished cooling in orbit above the colony. They came with prefabricated buildings and water systems and medical units and enough food for a year, and they worked in shifts around the clock, and they did not stop. 90 days after the ash, Reed went to see it. He stood in what had been the main square of the colony's largest settlement. It had been flattened in the battle. Now there were new buildings on 3 sides, simple and clean, built to last. There was a market operating on the far end, stalls with produce and goods, people moving between them in the ordinary way people move when they are getting on with things. There was noise, which was the noise of a place where people lived, and it was the best sound Reed had heard in a long time. 2 children ran past him at speed, one chasing the other, neither of them looking where they were going in the way that children never do. One of them nearly ran into his leg and looked up and said sorry without stopping and kept running. Reed stood and watched them go. He thought about the 17 colonies that had burned before anyone answered. He thought about 412,000 people whose names were in a file on his desk that he had read once, all the way through, and would not read again because once was enough and the weight of it was already permanent. He did not call it a victory. He had never called it that, not once, not even in the moments when people around him had used the word and looked at him expecting agreement. He called it, quietly and only to himself, a debt partially paid. The rest of the debt was the work that came after. The building. The staying. The not forgetting. He put his cap back on and walked back through the market, past the stalls and the people and the noise, toward the landing pad where his shuttle waited. In Geneva, 3 days later, Nora Cross was at her desk when George Hart came in and placed a file in front of her. 7 worlds, he said. None of them Concordat members. Small populations, outer systems, species that Earth's databases had entries on but no formal contact with. All 7 had sent proposals through independent channels requesting discussion about whatever framework Earth intended to build going forward. Nora picked up the file. She read the first page, then the second, then set it down flat on her desk and took her glasses off and looked at the window. The Geneva sky was gray and low and it was raining, which it did often, and she had never minded it. She put her glasses back on. "George," she said. "Yes," he said, from the doorway. "Send a reply to all 7, she said. "Tell them we are listening. And that listening is how we prefer to begin." George wrote it down, nodded once, and left. Nora Cross looked at the file on her desk for a moment longer. Then she pulled it toward her and opened it to the first page again and started reading properly, from the beginning, the way you read something that matters. Outside, the rain came down on Geneva, quiet and steady and without any particular hurry.